This is the Impunity Observer podcast. I'm your host, Fergus Hodgson, and I'm the managing editor. And I have with me my colleague and our editor at large, Steve Hecht. We are focused on, we're a geopolitical intelligence organization focused on the nexus between Latin and Anglo-America, and we seek to align Latino and U.S. interests. These monthly live streams are a chance for us to catch up, to check back in on the work we've been doing, put them into audio and video form, and so I'm always pleased to connect with Steve. He writes about 4 articles per month, and we've got plenty to go over. Now, there has been some big news in Guatemala with the Odebrecht case. What's happened is that, well, I'll get Steve to explain in more detail, but basically a case has been reopened, or an investigation has been reopened, and that is opening a can of worms for some people. So, Steve, do you want to tell us what is the latest? Well, thank you for chatting with us today. And what is the latest in this case, and why is it so substantive? What did you write about it? We can get into your article in a second, but why did you focus on this issue?
Well, great to be with you again in this format, Fergus. And I wrote about it because this involves the United Nations, the State Department, and the Colombian government, and of course, Guatemala. And so it has the potential to unravel a viper's nest of crimes in Guatemala committed by the United Nations supposedly Anti-Impunity Commission, CICIG. So that's the reason that it's of interest to many parties.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the article which we worked on together. The State Department's criminals have nowhere to hide, and they're getting desperate because the backstory is that this Odebrecht case, which is one of profound corruption all across Latin America, included Guatemala, but some, let's say, judicial officials in Guatemala basically gave an exemption or let Odebrecht off the hook in Guatemala, which meant that the compensation or fines did not happen. And the latest recent, I think it was in December, ruling, either this December or early January ruling, was that this exemption or waiver was not legal, and therefore this can be assessed again, and also those who gave the waiver should be investigated themselves. So the key person at the heart of this is Ivan Velasquez. Now, why is it the case, Steve? Why is he so important to this case?
Ivan Velasquez was the commissioner of the CICIG, the last commissioner, when Guatemala expelled it and ended it. And Velasquez is now Colombia's defense minister. And so when the Guatemalan court overturned the illegal releases, opening up the case against the Odebrecht representatives, then of course the case also got opened for those who gave the illegal releases. And Ivan Velasquez was one of them. At the prosecutor general's office in Guatemala said they're charging Velasquez. There's no arrest warrant yet, but they say they're charging Velasquez, and they made public communications among the various officials, including Velasquez, and that is an illegal act, and Velasquez is vulnerable to prosecution for it. And his president Petro immediately reacted against that and accused Guatemala of corruption, as did the United Nations and, of course, the State Department. So they're all ganged up because they all want to hide the criminality, their own criminality, and what happened in Guatemala. And since Petro is tied to Velasquez and the State Department is tied to Velasquez, especially former Ambassador Todd Robinson, they have to do everything they can to hide that criminality.
And why do you think these officials granted the waiver? One bit I don't understand of the story is what they in particular have to gain from granting a waiver to Odebrecht, this multinational company, which I think is based in Germany, but obviously active in infrastructure in Latin America. I don't know whether they're ideologically aligned. What do you think the motive was there?
I don't think it matters all that much. That look, if you owe somebody $384 million, and if you can get off, how much is that worth? I mean, if you're talking about honest people, then that doesn't happen. It's not even a question. But Odebrecht pled guilty in federal court in New York to bribery, paid a $2.6 billion fine. So we already know they're not an honest company. So they have a chance to get off. So this nobody can prove it, at least as far as I know, and I hope somebody's investigating it, and they should be. But the presumption is that these people got paid money to let off the Odebrecht people.
Yeah, so it does appear prima facie on the surface that someone has greased the wheels behind the scenes. So there wasn't necessarily an ideological alignment, but just a pro quo, if I pronounced that one correctly.
That's
So there
correct.
was a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours situation, but we don't really know. Just something happened to make these officials grant a waiver to Odebrecht, which seems inexplicable, right? It's hard. It's very hard to explain why you would give a waiver to a company that owes almost $400 million to Guatemala and just say, well, you don't owe it anymore, you're off.
Well,
And
the ostensible reason, of course, the State Department claims that Velasquez and Sandoval and Telmaldana, all protected by them, uh, were attempting to get testimony of the Odebrecht people who committed crimes so that they could process their ideological enemies in Guatemala who received those bribes. Now, that's pretty absurd. You got the people that owe the $384 million, and if you got a criminal case against the ex-officials, well, okay, fine, try to push it there, but why would you grant a release for $384 million, plus the fact that that's illegal, because only the Solicitor General, meaning the state attorney, has the legal authority to grant the release in a civil case. And granting a release on payment, that's a civil matter. It is not a criminal matter. And that's the heart of the case, that Sandoval and Aldana and Velasquez had absolutely no authority. The public ministry of Guatemala had no authority to grant a civil release. And as a matter of fact, the Solicitor General at that time filed a criminal complaint against Sandoval and some others for having granted that release.
yeah,
And
so as you said,
that's why the court overturned it.
yeah, the public reason, I guess, like you said, is that they were doing some kind of negotiation and I guess getting some sort of witness advantages out of these participants from Odebrecht. So I guess that's the public case. Now everything is back on the table, and so the Odebrecht engagement with Guatemala, for which there was no compensation paid to Guatemala, is being reinvestigated. Not only the actual company and its activities, but those who granted the waivers. And that, as you said, ensnares Ivan Velasquez and various other officials. Now, because of the time, well, first, Ivan Velasquez was working with the United Nations or the UN-appointed CICIG Commission, or the Anti-Impunity Commission. And then the other people involved were part of, let's say, a U.S. State Department-aligned judiciary in Guatemala, at least during that time. This is prior to Giammattei taking office, and even probably prior to Jimmy Morales. But anyway, so they're under the gun. Do you have any sense for whether any of them will pay a price or face justice?
That is a great question, and that Guatemala's future, to some extent, depends on that. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that they acted illegally. So the question is Guatemala able to process the case? Now, Guatemala is going forward with it, and they have the United Nations, the State Department, the Biden regime, and the government of Colombia all aligned against them, because each one of them has an interest in that their criminality not be discovered. And the people of Guatemala, the people of the United States, the people of Colombia, and anybody interested in making the United Nations act like it's supposed to, all have an interest in exposing this. So you have the globalist system against people who believe in the rule of law, and that's what this confrontation is all about. Now, of course, the State Department and the UN and the President of Colombia, they all claim that they are champions of justice. Well, take a good look at everything they do. We can give example after example, and we can show that that is not true. And so far, they've all gotten away with this. And so this case has the potential to expose all of these people.
Mm. Yeah, it is. Yeah, so it is an important case. And right now it seems to be in a war of words. How important is all this dialogue or this banter on Twitter and in press releases to actually the final outcome?
Well, it really depends on what happens in Guatemala. I mean, right now, the judiciary is much more independent than it's been, well, than it was under State Department control from 2016 to 2021. And that's what bothers the State Department. The Prosecutor General's office, they're really doing a great job. They are enforcing the law, and the State Department is livid and is accusing them of corruption. Now, there's an election coming up in Guatemala in June. It's already it's starting, and that needs to be handled properly, because if it's not, then the State Department is going to use that and try to discredit Guatemala as part of trying to kill this case. And as a matter of fact, they want to kill a lot of cases. They're going nuts because all of the people that they have formally honored with State Department awards and who they've supported and support currently as not refugees, they're fugitives in the United States, because if they come back to Guatemala, they got to stand trial. Well, the State Department needs to suppress this information, because if there's ever an investigation, and that investigation will uncover it. I mean, we've exposed, the Impunity Observer, all kinds of public information that shows criminality on the part of the State Department. So if that ever leads to a real investigation, it'll be like a cat with a ball of string, that once you start pulling on it, the whole thing unravels, and that's exactly what they want to avoid.
Yeah, to put it lightly, the State Department officials would have egg on their faces, because they have
Okay.
literally granted awards and given amnesty or safe haven to fugitives. It's embarrassing or humiliating for them if these people are clear criminals back in Guatemala. And the State Department, U.S. State Department, appears reluctant to let that happen.
Well, of course, they're going to do whatever they can to keep it from happening, but it's worse than embarrassing. Some of those people in the State Department over the last decade are vulnerable to criminal charges themselves in the United States and punishment in the United States. Now, of course, today that's impossible with the totally politicized Justice Department that the Biden regime is running, very, very similar to what they ran in Guatemala between 2016 and 2021. And but if the United States wakes up and the United States recovers its rule of law, and in 2025 has a government that actually applies the law, these people could find themselves eventually in jail for what they did in Guatemala.
Okay, and yeah, the article, please go to impunityobserver.com. I also placed it in the discussion if you're watching on YouTube. The article is "The State Department's Criminals Have Nowhere to Hide." And perhaps another fascinating angle which we should address before we move on is the way that this is ensnaring, yes, the Colombian defense minister, so the Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, and even from memory, Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan, has weighed in. So a lot of people seem to be antsy about a criminal case in Guatemala that really, to me, should be an open book. They should just go ahead and investigate it. They're very annoyed that people would even look at it.
Well, of course, because it leads to their criminality. I mean, Petro and Velasquez have a long history together. And Velasquez was an assistant magistrate, and he was working with Petro to defame and however they could attack their political opposition, and so they are tied together. And if Velasquez goes down, it's very possible that Petro is going to be exposed too. And of course, Velasquez's job as Colombian defense minister is to destroy, weaken to the extent that he can, the Colombian security forces. He fired 52 generals as his first act, and he's doing everything he can to reduce their ability to enforce the law. And Petro is trying to create militias. If he succeeds in creating armed militias and in decreasing the ability of the Colombian security forces, then he might be in position to do a coup against his own government and become another Maduro-like Chavista dictator. And that's really their goal. It was their goal in Guatemala, and it's their goal all over the world. You know, that group. But in Colombia, that's what Petro and Velasquez are trying to do. And the last thing they need is anything that shows that Velasquez is a complete criminal, which he is.
Yeah, if people want to learn more about Velasquez, we have a great profile on him prepared by Paz Gomez of the Ecuadorian. Ivan Velasquez, Social Justice Caudillo, or in Spanish, Un Caudillo de la Justicia. And so that gives a great deal of detail into his long-term or ongoing relationships with leftists or Marxists throughout Latin America. And in terms of Gustavo Petro, it's no secret that he was a Marxist guerrilla in his youth. And often I find this hard to believe or hard to understand that these literal terrorists get into political power somehow. How anyone supports them, I don't get it. But it is the case that Petro was I'm trying to remember the name of the group right now, but he was a guerrilla in Colombia. Okay, let's move on a bit, Steve. So let's address your latest article then about the weaponization, or there's a committee in the House of Representatives on government weaponization, or another way to refer to it would be the lawfare, or the use of the government to hurt or use it as a weapon against those who might be impeding the regime. So why is this committee so crucial, this weaponization committee?
Well, that article that you just mentioned was posted this morning on BizPac Review. Anybody can find it there. And the problem for the Biden regime is that this committee on weaponization of government could expose, if it gets the information that it seeks, it will expose Biden regime criminality. They have weaponized the government. They persecute, not prosecute. They persecute their political enemies with the Justice Department. They don't process. They don't prosecute their allies when their allies commit crimes, such as demonstrating in front of the houses of Supreme Court justices, which is clearly against the law. No prosecutions for that. And they go after people who protest abortions peacefully. They arrest them. But the people that promote them, they get complete protection. That's just a small example. And there are plenty of others more important than that.
Yeah, this sort of thing breaks my heart because it's the incremental chipping away at freedom. It is because if you know that, let's say, the tax system will be used against you, or whatever it may be, or the surveillance state will be used against you, if you happen to go against the regime line, people will change their behavior. They will self-censor, and it's a slow and not invisible. It's a subtle way of eroding any kind of freedom the United States has. And
the ultimate goal is to extinguish freedom, is to create a dictatorship. They think that they should be in power and they shouldn't have any limits. And it's unfortunately, even their own party, most of the people there don't realize if they did, they probably wouldn't support it. And the opposition doesn't understand it, except part of the opposition. There are people that do understand it. And this committee is an existential threat to that totalitarian plan to create a dictatorship, because it will expose it. And so the only thing that the regime has is their usual demonize and stonewall strategy. In other words, these people are so evil, don't believe anything they say. And as long as they're able to maintain that, they think they're in the game. That's one of the reasons that they didn't get trounced in the midterm elections in November. And that strategy has been working very well for them. They have regime partners. We can call it state media, really, and they're attacking that. They will attack mercilessly this committee, and the Republicans need to find other ways around. They should absolutely keep on with that committee. That committee is the key thing to recover American liberty, but it needs to have other ways to get this information and to get make the public aware of the evils of politicized justice.
Yeah, Steve referred to state media, or what I call regime media. This is a huge problem, that the legacy or dinosaur media outlets are in the pockets of the Democratic Party regime in the United States, or I don't even know whether the Democratic Party, you could say the permanent bureaucracy of the United States, because these media outlets want to get influence or cozy up to those who they see as in power. And so, but that obviously they then filter or impede the free flow of information. And particularly this committee is important because it's addressing the use of government to basically preserve the regime rather than enforce the law. And a blatant example, which is not disputed, everyone can look this up, it's out there, is that during the Obama era, I think it began in maybe 2009, 2010, when the Tea Party movement was getting momentum, he wanted to stop that because it would hurt his re-election chances. And so he worked with the IRS to basically block all the nonprofit applications for any organization that had Tea Party in its name, or even Patriots or similar titles like that. So that was a use of the tax system to stop political opposition to the regime. It's out there. Everyone can see it, and yet it seems to have gone down the memory hole for many people. And what Steve is concerned about is, one, investigating these uses of lawfare, and two, its expansion going forward. And let me just quote a little bit from Steve's BizPac Review article, which, as he said, just went live today. The House Judiciary Committee's investigation of government weaponization threatens the regime's agenda of creating a one-party state. Of course, they would, the regime wants to be at the helm of this one-party state. And indispensable to this control of justice is control of justice to persecute political opponents and protect allies. So if you're an opponent, you're going to get persecuted, or if you're an ally, you're going to get protected. Of course, everyone wants to become an ally. So it's a way of expanding your, let's say, domain of support, of your patronage, your political patronage. So is there anything else you want to say about this article, Steve? How, we're still early days with this committee. Again, are you optimistic that they will start to actually generate some change?
I think there's a good chance of it. I think they need to be aware of the actual agenda of destroying the constitutional republic and creating a dictatorship. And I think they need to educate the public on that. Of course, part of that is getting the information. It's going to be hard for them to get the information because the Biden regime, if it gives the information, they bury themselves. What the committee needs to do is find ways to create support for their efforts. They need some of the people who are today indifferent or apathetic or even supporting the regime to realize they personally have an interest. They're in danger if this continues on. And so they need to increase pressure on the regime to cooperate. They need the committee needs to create public acceptance of its role of exposing this stuff. And they're going to have to find a way around this demonization because they're not going to get anything. Yeah, they're going to make criminal referrals when there's no cooperation. And of course, who has to process those? The Justice Department, which they will never do unless we have a pro-America Republican administration in 2025 and a Congress, of course, that will actually enforce the law. And that's what the stakes are right now and for the next 2 years. This is a critical time for the United States. It's either recover your freedom or lose it in the next 2 years.
Yeah, this reference you make to demonization is an important one. Now, I'm not sure whether, and Steve discusses this in detail in his article. So I put the link in the live stream here, and also it's up on BizPack Review on the homepage right now. The demonization that goes on is a form of indoctrination or mind control because it closes off your mind. It closes off your ability to take in new ideas or new information. And so by using dirty words or name calling or whatever it may be to say, don't even listen to this person or don't even go there, you have narrowed the frame of reference of someone's mind and kept him under control or in a confined form of thinking. And this is why independent media is so important. It's why our own research is so important, that you've got to get out of this confined dialogue, which is a bunch of junk, and get to the real issues. So, and you said, Steve, in your article that you really want the House representatives on this committee to find ways to, circumvent these walls that have been put up in people's minds, which get in the way of us actually just asking legitimate questions.
Yes, that's correct, Fergus. It's unscrupulous totalitarian manipulators understand human weakness and are experts at taking advantage of it. And you can reduce it to, we all have a tendency to blame the other and not to look inside ourselves to understand our own discomfort. And so that's how they focus attention on the evil other. And so everybody who opposes the regime are evil, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, racist, white supremacists, insurrectionists.
Yeah. And these words are so charged that people don't want to be associated with them, even if they're inaccurate, right? They're misleading. But just the fear of being associated is enough to make many people just turn away. And that's the problem. You people, I'm really, I appreciate people listening to these shows. Do not be intimidated by these silly words that are used to intimidate you, used to confine your thinking. And if you're here, of course, you've already made a great step. And Steve has more work coming out. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but Steve has done great work this last month. And do you want to touch just briefly on your one article about Kevin McCarthy being House Speaker and how you don't want the Republicans to be fighting against each other. You want them to focus on the enemy, which is the growth of incremental totalitarianism.
Well, sure. I mean, Republicans, this is not about policy. I mean, if the Republicans fight among themselves and make this about whatever their issues are, which is normal. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But under these circumstances, it's really dangerous because it facilitates, by not identifying the totalitarian nature of the Biden regime and what came before it, including Trump's administration. Trump wasn't in charge of federal government. The federal bureaucrats were in charge of the federal government. They resisted Trump at every turn. So they're with the totalitarians. So we can't have a pro-America government unless we change the way the federal bureaucracy works, make it conform to the Constitution and to the laws. And this is the biggest problem that we have. We have to recognize it. And the committee, the Republicans are doing the right thing. They're off to a great start. And they need to be aware of what the stakes are. Our liberty is at stake in this. That's the basic bottom line against a totalitarian nightmare.
Yeah, I fear a lot of people do not understand the threat to the United States that has been growing for a long time. And obviously, because Steve has lived most of his life in Guatemala, he is familiar with what happens elsewhere and where this path can lead. Folks, thanks so much for listening to the show today, our monthly live stream with the Impunity Observer. If you haven't already, please follow us on Twitter, hit that subscribe button on YouTube, go to a Telegram, wherever we're on all sorts of platforms now. I lose track, Facebook. Go to impunityobserver.com, where you can get all the links to our different real-time channels. Also, be sure to subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter. It is free, and it gives you a nice summary of all the work we've done. It's a great way to keep up to date. I'm extremely proud of the work we've been doing. Steve has been, working intensely too on his side, getting the real story behind the story. So, Steve, thanks for chatting, mate, and I look forward to next month.
Likewise, Fergus. Thank you.
Cheers.